What if the person everyone treated like she didn't exist became the only one your father trusted with his life? Who let her in here? The voice was cold, sharp enough to cut through the silence. Omar al-Haytham stood frozen at the doorway of his own mansion, his hand still gripping the handle as if the world had suddenly stopped moving. Inside the dimly lit room, his father, once a proud, unshakable man, was sitting quietly on the edge of the bed. And beside him, a cleaner, her uniform plain, her hands worn, her presence completely out of place. Yet Walter Hayes was holding her hand like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "I thought you weren't coming back," the old man whispered, his voice trembling. Not with fear, but with relief. The room fell silent. Omar's expression slowly darkened. Because in that moment, he realized something terrifying. His own father looked at a stranger the way he had never looked at him. "Before we go any further, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe, because what you're about to see might change the way you judge people forever." Because what Omar saw next wasn't just shocking. It was something he was never supposed to witness. Omar al-Haytham was a man shaped by two worlds and trusted neither completely. At 38, he stood at the peak of a global empire built on discipline, calculation, and relentless ambition. Born into a wealthy Middle Eastern family, Omar had inherited not just immense resources, but a legacy of expectation. His family name carried influence across energy markets and international finance. But Omar had chosen a different path. He came to the United States in his early 20s, studied, adapted, and eventually built his own identity, separate from the shadow of his lineage. To the public, he was known as a brilliant investor, a strategic mind who turned struggling companies into billion-dollar powerhouses. To those who worked under him, he was precise, demanding, and impossible to deceive. And to those who truly knew him, he was a man who believed control was the only thing that kept life from falling apart. The estate he owned on the outskirts of Boston reflected that belief perfectly. Tall iron gates, private security stationed day and night, cameras placed with surgical precision across every corridor, every entrance, every blind spot eliminated. Inside, marble floors stretched beneath crystal chandeliers, and silence carried the quiet weight of wealth. It wasn't just a home. It was a system, a controlled environment where nothing and no one was left to chance. At the center of that system lived the only person Omar could not control, Walter Hayes, his father. Walter had once been everything Omar respected: intelligent, principled, and quietly strong. As a history professor, he had spent his life teaching others about the rise and fall of empires, the consequences of power, and the fragility of human connection. But time had stripped away that certainty. A series of minor strokes had fractured Walter's memory, leaving him suspended between clarity and confusion. Some mornings, he spoke with the same sharp wit that had once filled lecture halls. Other days, he drifted through conversations like a stranger in his own life. And on the worst days, he didn't recognize his own son. "Sir, your father refused breakfast again." The voice of Mrs. Dalton, the head housekeeper, broke the stillness of Omar's study. Omar sat behind a polished desk, his posture straight, his attention fixed on a digital report glowing on his tablet. He didn't look up immediately. "Was the medication administered?" he asked, his tone even. "Yes, but he resisted. He's becoming increasingly uncooperative." A pause. Then, finally, Omar lifted his gaze. "He's not uncooperative," he said calmly. "He's losing control. There's a difference." Mrs. Dalton nodded quickly. "Of course, sir. Adjust the routine, Omar continued. Consistency is the only variable we can stabilize. Yes, sir. Routine, structure, control. That was how Omar approached every problem. It had worked in business. It had built his empire. But it wasn't working here, because no system could force a man to feel understood. Walter had grown distant, not just in memory, but in spirit. He rejected nurses, ignored staff, and often sat alone for hours, staring into empty space as if searching for something long gone. And Omar didn't know how to reach him anymore. So instead, he monitored. Every staff member was vetted, every movement recorded, every interaction tracked through a network of discrete surveillance systems embedded throughout the estate. Omar didn't rely on trust. He relied on information, which was why, when he announced his sudden business trip to Chicago, no one questioned it. They never did. I'll be gone for a week, Omar said the evening before his departure, standing at the head of the dining room table. Maintain the schedule. Report anything unusual. His tone was calm, but final. Mrs. Dalton and the rest of the staff nodded in unison. Yes, sir. No one asked why the trip had been arranged so abruptly. No one asked why he seemed more observant than usual. And no one realized that Omar had no intention of being as far away as he claimed. Because Omar didn't leave things to chance. Not when it came to his father. Not when it came to his home. Down the long corridor connecting the main wing to the service area, a woman pushed a cleaning cart slowly across the polished floor. Grace Miller. She moved quietly, almost instinctively avoiding attention. Her uniform was simple, her posture reserved, her presence easily overlooked in a house filled with people trained to serve but never to stand out. At 32, Grace had learned that invisibility could be a kind of protection. People didn't question what they didn't notice. Stay out of the private rooms, one of the junior staff reminded her as she passed. Grace nodded. I will. She always did. She followed every rule, kept her head down, did her job. Because for her, this wasn't just another assignment. It was survival. Across the city, in a small apartment that barely fit the life she was trying to hold together, her 8-year-old son, Ethan, waited for her to come home. Every shift she worked, every silent insult she endured, every hour she stayed on her feet. It was all for him. Walking away from this job wasn't an option. Not now. Not when everything depended on it. As Grace reached the end of the hallway, she slowed. A door stood slightly open. The library. Soft light spilled into the corridor, illuminating the edges of towering bookshelves inside. She hesitated. This room wasn't part of her assigned route, but something about the quiet inside felt different. Carefully, she stepped closer. And that was when she saw him. Walter Hayes sat alone, a book resting loosely in his hands. His eyes were unfocused, his expression distant, as though he were lost somewhere between memory and silence. Grace remained at the doorway. Sir? She said gently. No response. She took a step inside. Are you all right? Walter blinked slowly. Then, after a long pause, he looked at her. Not with suspicion, not with authority, but with quiet curiosity. Are you new here? He asked. Grace nodded softly. Yes, sir. Walter studied her for a moment, then glanced down at the book in his lap. Do you read? He asked. The question caught her off guard. I used to, she said. I don't have much time anymore. Walter nodded, as if that answer carried more meaning than she realized. People forget things when they stop reading, he murmured. Grace didn't interrupt. She simply stood there, listening, And for the first time in days, Walter didn't feel completely alone. Miles away, or at least that's what everyone believed, Omar al-Haytham sat in a quiet, dimly lit room. Not in Chicago, not on any business trip, but in a private surveillance suite just outside the city. A screen flickered in front of him. The library camera. His eyes narrowed slightly as he watched the interaction unfold in real time. Unscheduled, unplanned, uncontrolled. And for the first time in a long while, something inside his carefully constructed world had begun to shift. Who exactly was this woman? Grace Miller had learned a long time ago that life didn't slow down for anyone. Not for grief, not for exhaustion, and certainly not for people like her. By the time the sun rose over the narrow streets of her neighborhood, Grace was already awake. The small apartment she shared with her son was quiet, save for the soft hum of an old refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic beginning to build outside. She stood in the kitchen, carefully measuring out cereal into a chipped bowl, stretching what little she had to last the week. "Mom?" a sleepy voice called from the bedroom. "I'm here, sweetheart," she replied gently. A moment later, Ethan appeared in the doorway, his hair messy, his eyes still heavy with sleep. At 8 years old, he was quieter than most children his age, more observant, more cautious, as if life had taught him too early that not everything was as simple as it should be. "Do you have to go early again?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. Grace forced a small smile. "Just for a little while. I'll be back before dinner." Ethan nodded, but there was a flicker of disappointment in his eyes that he didn't try to hide. Grace noticed. She always noticed. "I'll bring you something from the city," she added, trying to lighten the mood. "You don't have to," Ethan said softly. "I know," she replied. "I want to." That was the truth. Every small thing she did for him. After breakfast, Grace helped him get ready for school, double-checking his backpack, adjusting his jacket, pressing a quick kiss to his forehead before he left. "Be careful, okay?" she said. "You too," Ethan replied. The door closed behind him, and the apartment fell silent once more. Grace stood there for a moment, her shoulders dropping as the weight of the day settled over her. Then she moved, because she had no choice but to keep going. By the time she arrived at the Al-Haytham estate, the world felt entirely different. The gates opened with silent precision. The driveway stretched endlessly ahead, lined with perfectly trimmed hedges and sculptures that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than someone's front yard. Inside, everything was spotless, controlled, perfect. And yet, strangely cold. Grace pushed her cleaning cart down the hallway, her footsteps quiet against the polished floor. Around her, staff members moved with practiced efficiency, their voices low, their expressions carefully neutral. No one greeted her. No one needed to. She was simply part of the routine. But something had changed. Since the day she stepped into the library, she couldn't shake the image of Walter Hayes sitting there alone, staring into nothing, or the way his voice had softened when he spoke to her. "Do you read?" The question lingered in her mind longer than it should have, because it wasn't just a question. It felt like a memory trying to reach the surface. As Grace passed by the same hallway again, she slowed without meaning to. The library door was closed this time. She hesitated, then kept walking. Rules mattered here, and she couldn't afford to break them. Inside the main living area, Mrs. Dalton stood speaking with 2 members of the medical staff. "He refused again this morning," she was saying, her tone tight with frustration. "If this continues, we may need to consider stronger measures." Grace lowered her gaze and continued past, but the words stayed with her. Refused. Stronger measures. Something about it didn't sit right. Later that afternoon, as she was cleaning near the staircase, a sudden noise echoed from upstairs. A sharp crash, followed by a raised voice. "No!" Grace froze. The staff nearby exchanged quick glances, but no one moved immediately. Another voice, strained, confused. "I said no! I don't want that!" Grace looked up. Without thinking, she set down her cloth and moved toward the stairs. "Grace," one of the staff called quietly. "That's not your area." But she kept going. At the top of the stairs, the door to Walter's room stood partially open. Inside, a nurse was trying to guide Walter back toward the bed. "Sir, please." "I don't know you," Walter snapped, pulling his arm away. His voice wasn't just angry, it was afraid. Grace stepped into the doorway. "Sir?" she said gently. Everything stopped. Walter turned. For a brief second, confusion clouded his expression. Then, recognition. Not clear, not complete, but enough. "You," he murmured. The tension in the room shifted. The nurse looked at Grace, clearly annoyed. "He needs to take his medication," she said. "We're handling it." Grace nodded slightly. "I understand." She took a cautious step forward. "I'm not here to interfere," she added softly. "Just, maybe let me try something?" The nurse hesitated. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't appropriate. But Walter was still watching Grace, his breathing uneven, his posture tense. And slowly, the nurse stepped back. "Fine," she said, "but don't make this worse." Grace moved closer, keeping her movements calm, deliberate. "Hey," she said gently, lowering herself slightly so she was at Walter's eye level. "It's okay." Walter's grip on the edge of the table loosened just a fraction. "They keep changing things," he muttered. "I don't know what's happening." Grace nodded, as if she understood exactly what he meant. "That must feel scary," she said. "No commands, no instructions, just acknowledgement." Walter exhaled slowly. "They don't listen," he added, quieter now. Grace glanced briefly at the glass of water and the medication on the tray, then back at him. "Do you want to sit down for a minute?" she asked. Walter hesitated, then nodded. She helped guide him, not forcefully, not urgently, just enough to give him a sense of control. The nurse watched in silence. Walter sat. His shoulders dropped, and for the first time since the outburst began, the room felt calm again. Grace reached for the glass, but didn't hand it to him immediately. "Can I sit with you while you take this?" she asked. Walter looked at her. Then slowly, he nodded again. Across the room, the nurse stared in disbelief, because nothing they had tried had worked like this. And somewhere far away, watching through a silent screen, Omar Al-Haytham leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing, because this wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't supposed to happen. So how was it that the one person he had never noticed was suddenly the only one his father seemed to trust? The change didn't happen all at once. At first it was subtle, almost easy to dismiss. Walter Hayes began to resist less. Not completely, not consistently, but enough for people to notice. "Try again," the nurse said one morning, holding out a spoon. "Just one bite." Walter frowned, his hand twitching slightly on the armrest. For a moment it looked like he might push the tray away like he always did. Then his eyes shifted. Past the nurse, toward the doorway. Grace stood there, her cleaning cart parked quietly beside her. She hadn't meant to stop. She had only been passing by. But Walter had seen her, and that changed everything. "You," he said, his voice low. The nurse stiffened. "Sir, please, focus and—" "Let her come in," Walter interrupted. There was a pause. A small, uncomfortable silence. Mrs. Dalton, who had just stepped into the room, crossed her arms tightly. "She's not part of the care staff," she said sharply. "She has her duties elsewhere." Walter's gaze didn't leave Grace. "I said," he repeated, slower this time, "let her come in." The authority in his voice, faint but unmistakable, made the room still. Grace hesitated. Every instinct told her to step back, to avoid drawing attention, to follow the rules that had kept her employed this long. But something in Walter's expression wasn't asking. It was reaching. Carefully, she stepped forward. "I don't want to cause trouble," she said quietly. Mrs. Dalton's lips tightened. "You already are." Grace lowered her gaze, but didn't retreat. Walter exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Just sit," he said, gesturing weakly toward the chair beside him. Grace obeyed. The nurse watched, uncertain, as if waiting for this strange interruption to fall apart. It didn't. Grace didn't touch the tray, didn't instruct, didn't correct. She simply sat beside him. "You didn't finish your book," she said gently, nodding toward the one resting on the table nearby. Walter glanced at it, then back at her. "They moved it," he muttered. Grace reached over, picked it up, and placed it back in his hands. "Here," she said. Walter's fingers curled around the cover. Something in his expression softened. After a moment, Grace looked at the tray again. "Do you want to eat before we read?" she asked. No pressure, no demand, just a choice. Walter hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded. The nurse blinked in disbelief as he accepted the spoon. One bite, then another. The room felt different, like something fragile had shifted into place. Across the hall, 2 staff members whispered quietly. "This isn't normal," one of them said. "It won't last," the other replied. But it did. Over the next few days, Walter began asking for Grace. Not loudly, not insistently, but enough that it couldn't be ignored. "She calms him," one of the younger nurses admitted reluctantly. Mrs. Dalton didn't like that, not one bit. "She's overstepping," she said during a staff briefing. "And you're all allowing it." "She's helping," the nurse replied carefully. "She's interfering," Mrs. Dalton snapped. "There's a difference." But no one argued further, because everyone knew who held authority in the house. Everyone except Walter. And now, possibly Grace. That afternoon, as Grace was wiping down a table in the hallway, Mrs. Dalton approached her. "You seem to have forgotten your position," she said coldly. Grace straightened slightly. "I haven't, ma'am." "Then why are you spending time in areas you weren't assigned to?" Grace kept her voice calm. "I only go where I'm asked." Mrs. Dalton stepped closer. "You are a cleaner," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut. "Nothing more. Do not confuse kindness with permission." Grace nodded slowly. "I understand." But even as she said the words, she knew something had already changed. Because later that evening, as she prepared to leave, a message came through from the main desk. "Mr. Hayes would like to see you before you go." Grace froze. The other staff exchanged glances. Mrs. Dalton's expression darkened. "That won't be necessary," she said firmly. "He needs rest." But the request had already been logged, and protocol was protocol. Grace found herself standing once again at the door to Walter's room. This time, she knocked. "Come in," his voice called. She stepped inside. Walter sat near the window, the fading light casting long shadows across the room. "You're leaving?" he asked. "Yes, sir." He nodded slowly, then gestured to the chair beside him. "Sit for a moment." Grace hesitated, then did as he asked. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was peaceful. "I remember things sometimes," Walter said suddenly. Grace turned slightly. "Is that good?" she asked. Walter considered the question. "Not always," he admitted. "But when I do, I know when someone is real." Grace didn't respond. Didn't know how to. Walter looked at her. "You don't treat me like I'm broken," he said. The words landed heavier than they should have. "I just talk to you," Grace replied softly. Walter nodded. "That's why I trust you." Outside the room, footsteps passed quietly. Inside, the air shifted. Because trust, in a house built on control, was the one thing Omar al-Haytham could not predict. And miles away, in front of a glowing screen, Omar watched the moment unfold, his expression unreadable, but his grip on the edge of the table tightened. Because something was happening inside his own home. Something he hadn't approved. Something he hadn't planned. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he was the one in control anymore. So the question remained. How far would this go before he stepped in? The nights were always the hardest. That was something no one in the house wanted to admit out loud. During the day, everything could be managed. Meals scheduled, medication administered, routines enforced. There were people everywhere, systems in place, constant movement that made it easier to ignore the quiet unraveling happening beneath the surface. But at night, there was no distraction, only silence and memory. It started just after midnight. Grace had already finished her shift and was preparing to leave through the service entrance when she heard it, a faint sound echoing down the hallway. Not loud, not violent, but wrong. A low, restless murmur. She paused, her hand resting on the door handle. For a moment, she told herself to keep going. This wasn't her responsibility. There were nurses on duty, people trained for this. But the sound came again. More strained this time, and without thinking, she turned back. The hallway felt colder at night, the polished floors reflecting only fragments of light from the dimmed fixtures above. As she moved closer, the murmuring turned into something clearer. No, not again. Walter. Grace stopped outside his door. It was slightly open. Inside, the room was dark except for a single lamp near the bed. Walter sat upright, his breathing uneven, his eyes darting around the room as if he were trapped somewhere between the present and a memory he couldn't escape. "Sir?" Grace said softly. He didn't respond. "We have to go," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They're coming." Grace stepped inside slowly. "It's okay," she said gently. "You're safe." Walter flinched. "No," he insisted. "You don't understand. I'm here," Grace said, her voice steady. "Just look at me." For a moment he didn't. Then his eyes found hers, and something shifted. Not completely, but enough. "They took everything," he murmured, his expression tightening with fear. "I couldn't stop it." Grace didn't interrupt, didn't correct. She simply moved closer, careful not to invade his space. "That sounds really hard," she said quietly. Walter's breathing slowed, just slightly. "They said it would be temporary," he continued, his voice breaking. "But nothing ever came back." Grace recognized the pattern. This wasn't about the present. It was a memory. Fragmented. Distorted, but real to him. She pulled a chair closer and sat down. "You don't have to go through it alone," she said. Walter looked at her, confusion flickering across his face. "Who are you?" he asked. Grace smiled gently. "Someone who's here," she replied. There was a long pause. Then, slowly, Walter's shoulders relaxed. The tension in his hands eased, and the room grew quieter. Minutes passed. Grace stayed. She didn't check the time, didn't think about the fact that her shift had already ended. All that mattered was the man sitting in front of her. Lost, afraid, and slowly finding his way back. After a while, she reached for the book resting on the nightstand. "Do you remember this one?" she asked softly. Walter blinked, then looked down at the cover. His fingers brushed against it, hesitant at first. "I used to read this," he said. "I know," Grace replied. "You told me." He looked at her again, this time with a little more clarity. "Will you read it?" he asked. Grace nodded. "Of course." Her voice was calm as she began, each word steady, deliberate, filling the silence that had once felt so heavy. Walter listened. Really listened. His breathing evened out. His gaze softened. And little by little, the fear faded. By the time she finished the first chapter, his eyes had begun to close. "Thank you," he murmured. Grace set the book aside. "You should rest," she said. Walter nodded faintly, but just before he drifted off, his hand moved, reaching out, uncertain. Grace hesitated, then gently placed her hand in his. He didn't grip it tightly, just enough to feel that it was there, that he wasn't alone. Outside the room, a figure stood in the shadows. Mrs. Dalton. She had arrived minutes earlier, drawn by the unusual activity. And what she saw did not sit well with her. A cleaner, sitting beside the man she had spent years managing, speaking to him as if they were equals, touching his hand as if she belonged there. Her expression hardened. This wasn't appropriate. This wasn't acceptable. And most importantly, this wasn't something she could allow to continue. The next morning, the story spread quietly among the staff. She was in his room for hours, past her shift, alone with him. The words weren't accusations yet, but they carried weight, suspicion. By midday, Mrs. Dalton had already formed her conclusion. "She's crossing boundaries," she said firmly during a private conversation with the senior nurse. "And I intend to put a stop to it." "But he was calm this morning," the nurse replied carefully. "More than usual." "That's not the point," Mrs. Dalton snapped. "We have procedures for a reason." Later that afternoon, Grace was called into the main office. She stood quietly in front of Mrs. Dalton, her hands folded, her expression composed. "You stayed beyond your assigned hours last night," Mrs. Dalton said. "Yes," Grace replied. "Mr. Hayes needed—" "You are not part of his care team," Mrs. Dalton interrupted sharply. Grace nodded. "I understand." "Do you?" Mrs. Dalton stepped closer. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you're inserting yourself into a role that doesn't belong to you." Grace didn't respond immediately. She chose her words carefully. "I wasn't trying to take anyone's place," she said. "He was scared. I just stayed." Mrs. Dalton's eyes narrowed. "And what exactly do you gain from that?" The question hung in the air. Heavy. Loaded. Grace met her gaze. "Nothing," she said simply. Mrs. Dalton didn't believe her. Or perhaps she didn't want to. Because in a house built on hierarchy and control, kindness without motive didn't make sense, and anything that didn't make sense was dangerous. Upstairs, Walter sat by the window once again. But this time, he wasn't staring into emptiness. He was waiting. Because for the first time in a long time, he knew someone would come back. And somewhere, watching everything unfold through silent screens, Omar Al-Haytham leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. But his mind was already moving ahead. Because this was no longer just an observation. It was a pattern. And patterns had consequences. So the question was no longer if he would intervene, but when. Saturday mornings were supposed to be quiet. At least that was what Grace had hoped. But life rarely followed what she hoped. "I can't find anyone to watch him," she said into her phone, her voice low as she stood near the kitchen window of her apartment. "Just for a few hours. I'll pay whatever I can." There was a pause on the other end, then a polite refusal. Grace closed her eyes briefly. "I understand. Thank you anyway." She ended the call and looked across the room. Ethan sat at the small table, carefully drawing lines on a piece of paper. He didn't look up, but she could tell he had heard everything. "You can come with me," she said gently. "Just for today. We'll stay out of the way." Ethan hesitated. "Are we allowed?" he asked. Grace forced a small smile. "Not exactly," she admitted. "But we'll be careful." Ethan nodded slowly. "I'll be quiet." "I know you will." An hour later, they stood outside the massive gates of the Al-Haytham estate. Ethan stared up at them, his eyes wide. "It's like a castle," he whispered. Grace squeezed his hand lightly. "Just stay close to me, okay?" The gates opened, and just like that, they stepped into a world that didn't belong to them. Inside, everything felt even more intimidating than usual. Grace kept her head down, guiding Ethan quickly through the service entrance. She had planned every step: where to go, which hallways to avoid, how to keep him unseen. But plans didn't always hold. As they passed the garden path leading toward the main wing, a voice called out, "You there?" Grace froze. Mrs. Dalton stood at the top of the steps, her posture rigid, her expression already disapproving. "What is this?" she demanded, her eyes locking onto Ethan. Grace stepped forward slightly, shielding him without making it obvious. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I couldn't find anyone to watch him today. He'll stay with me. He won't cause any trouble." Mrs. Dalton's lips pressed into a thin line. "This is not a daycare," she said coldly. "I understand. It's just for a few hours." "No," Mrs. Dalton replied sharply. "It's not appropriate. You know the rules." Grace lowered her gaze. "Yes, ma'am." Ethan tightened his grip on her hand. "I'll be good," he said softly. The innocence in his voice didn't soften Mrs. Dalton's expression. "That's not the point," she said. "People like you always think exceptions should be made." The words landed harder than they needed to. Grace felt it, but she didn't react. "I'll leave if necessary," she said quietly. Before Mrs. Dalton could respond, another voice interrupted. "Who's that?" They all turned. Walter Hayes stood at the far end of the path, supported by his cane. His posture was slightly unsteady, but his gaze was clear, more focused than it had been in days. Ethan looked up, surprised. Walter took a slow step forward. Then another. His eyes settled on the boy. "What's your name?" he asked. Ethan hesitated, glancing at Grace. "It's okay," she said gently. "Ethan?" he replied. Walter nodded. "Ethan?" he repeated, as if testing the name. There was a brief silence. Then, unexpectedly, Walter smiled. A real smile. "You like books, Ethan?" The question caught everyone off guard. Ethan blinked. "A little," he said. Walter gestured faintly toward the garden bench nearby. "I used to read here," he said. "A long time ago." Ethan looked at Grace again. She gave a small nod. Slowly, he stepped forward. Mrs. Dalton moved to intervene. "Sir, this isn't—" "Let them stay," Walter said, his voice calm but firm. The authority in it left no room for argument. Mrs. Dalton froze. For a moment it seemed like she might push back, but she didn't. Because even now, Walter Hayes still carried weight in this house. Grace exhaled quietly, relief mixing with unease. This wasn't how she had planned the day. Walter lowered himself carefully onto the bench, gesturing for Ethan to sit beside him. Ethan climbed up, still cautious. "What do you read?" Walter asked. Ethan thought for a moment. "Stories about trains," he said, "and maps." Walter's eyes lit up faintly. "Maps," he repeated. "Good choice." They sat in silence for a while, the air around them unexpectedly peaceful. Grace stood nearby, unsure whether to stay or step away. Mrs. Dalton watched from a distance, her expression tightening with every passing second. This was wrong. Completely wrong. A cleaner's child sitting beside the man she had spent years managing, laughing quietly, talking, connecting. It disrupted everything. Across the estate, security cameras captured the scene. And miles away, Omar Al-Haytham was watching. His fingers rested against the edge of the screen, his gaze fixed, unblinking. The image in front of him didn't match anything he understood. His father, calm, engaged, present. All because of a woman and a child who shouldn't have been there. Back in the garden, the moment continued. Ethan pointed at something on the ground, explaining it in his own quiet way. Walter listened, really listened, as if every word mattered, as if time itself had slowed. Then, suddenly, a sharp voice cut through the air. "This has gone far enough." Mrs. Dalton stepped forward, her patience finally breaking. "Grace, take your child and leave. Immediately." Ethan flinched. Grace stepped closer, her voice steady but low. "We were just—" "I don't care what you were doing," Mrs. Dalton snapped. "This is inappropriate, completely unacceptable." Walter's hand tightened slightly on his cane. "They're not hurting anyone," he said. Mrs. Dalton turned to him. "Sir, with all due respect, this is not your decision to make in your condition." The words hung in the air, heavy, sharp, wrong. For a moment, everything went still. Walter's expression changed. Not confused, not distant, but clear, focused, and deeply offended. His cane struck the ground with a sudden force. "Enough," he said. The single word echoed. And just like that, the balance of power shifted. Even from miles away, watching through a silent screen, Omar leaned forward. Because he had never seen his father react like that before. Not for him, not for anyone. So why now? Why for them? And more importantly, what did it mean? The sound of the cane striking the ground didn't just echo through the garden. It changed something. For a moment, no one spoke. Mrs. Dalton stood frozen, her authority challenged in a way she had never expected, especially not by the man she had long believed was slipping beyond clarity. Walter Hayes, however, did not look confused. He looked certain. "They stay," he said again, his voice quieter this time, but no less firm. Ethan sat still beside him, unsure whether to move or speak. Grace placed a gentle hand on her son's shoulder, her heart racing beneath a calm exterior. "Sir," Mrs. Dalton tried again, lowering her voice as if to regain control. "This isn't about preference. It's about safety. There are standards in this house." Walter turned his head slowly, fixing her with a steady gaze. "And you think kindness breaks those standards?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. "That's not what I meant," she replied quickly. "Then what did you mean?" Walter pressed. Mrs. Dalton hesitated, because for the first time in a long while, she didn't have a prepared answer. Grace stepped in gently. "We can leave," she said softly. "It's okay." Walter's expression shifted, not to anger, but to something deeper. Disappointment. "No," he said. "You don't leave because someone decides you don't belong." The words settled heavily in the air. Ethan looked up at him, wide-eyed. Mrs. Dalton's composure cracked, just slightly. "This is highly inappropriate," she said, her tone tightening again. "I'll be reporting this." Walter didn't respond. He simply turned back to Ethan. "Tell me more about the maps you like," he said. And just like that, he dismissed her. Mrs. Dalton stood there for another second, her face flushed with contained frustration, before turning sharply and walking away. Grace exhaled slowly, but the tension didn't disappear. It shifted. Later that afternoon, the consequences began. Grace was called into the staff room. The moment she stepped inside, she felt it, the change in the air. Eyes watching. Whispers stopping. Mrs. Dalton stood near the desk, arms crossed. "We need to address what happened earlier," she said. Grace nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "You brought an unauthorized individual onto the property," Mrs. Dalton continued. "You ignored protocol, and you interfered with a resident's care." Grace kept her voice steady. "I stayed where I could see him. He didn't cause any trouble." "That's not the point," Mrs. Dalton snapped. "You put us in a position where boundaries were crossed." Grace lowered her gaze. "I understand." "Do you?" Mrs. Dalton stepped closer. "Because from what I've seen, you seem very comfortable stepping outside your role." Grace didn't answer immediately. She chose her words carefully. "I never intended to cause any issues," she said. "Mr. Hayes asked us to stay. And you think that justifies it?" Mrs. Dalton's voice sharpened. "He's not in a condition to make rational decisions." The words hit harder than she expected. Not because they were directed at her, but because of what they implied about Walter. Grace looked up. "He knew exactly what he was saying," she replied quietly. That was the wrong thing to say. Mrs. Dalton's expression hardened instantly. "Be careful," she said. "You're not qualified to make that judgment." A silence followed, heavy, uncomfortable. Then one of the staff members cleared his throat. "There's also the matter of the watch," he said. Grace frowned slightly. "What watch?" Mrs. Dalton didn't look surprised. "Mr. Hayes reported his antique watch missing this morning," she said. "The one he keeps in his room." Grace's stomach tightened. "I haven't been in his room since last night," she said. "Exactly," Mrs. Dalton replied. "And you were there alone." The implication was clear. The room seemed to close in. "I didn't take anything," Grace said, her voice still calm, but firmer now. "Then you won't mind if we check," Mrs. Dalton said. Grace didn't move. She knew what this looked like, knew how easily suspicion fell on someone in her position. But she also knew something else. If she resisted, it would only make things worse. "Go ahead," she said quietly. The search wasn't long, but it felt endless. Every pocket, every compartment of her bag, every small space examined under watchful eyes. Ethan stood near the doorway, his face pale, his hands clenched at his sides. "Mom?" he whispered. Grace didn't look at him. She couldn't, because if she did, she might break. "It's not here," one of the staff finally said. Mrs. Dalton's expression didn't change. "That doesn't prove anything," she replied. But the damage had already been done. The room felt colder, heavier. Grace gathered her things slowly. "You're dismissed for the rest of the day," Mrs. Dalton said. Grace nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She took Ethan's hand and walked out. No apology, no acknowledgement. Just silence. Upstairs, Walter sat by the window again. But this time, something was different. He wasn't calm. He wasn't distant. He was watching, waiting. And when Grace passed through the hallway, he saw her. Saw the way her shoulders were slightly lower. Saw the way Ethan walked closer to her than usual. Walter's grip tightened on the armrest. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He already knew, because he had seen it before. In different places, with different people, the quiet humiliation, the unspoken accusation, the kind that left no marks, but stayed far longer. That night, Walter didn't ask for his book, didn't accept dinner, didn't speak much at all, and when the nurse tried to approach, he turned away. "I'm tired," he said. But it wasn't exhaustion. It was something else. Something deeper. And somewhere, watching everything unfold. Omar Al-Haytham sat in silence. The footage from earlier played again on the screen in front of him. The search. The whispers. The look on the boy's face. And for the first time since this began, something didn't sit right. Because this wasn't just a pattern anymore. It was a shift. One he hadn't predicted. One he didn't fully understand. And yet, he couldn't look away. So the question now wasn't just about Grace, or his father. It was about something far more unsettling. Had he been seeing everything clearly? Or had he been missing something important all along? The house felt different after that day. Quieter. Not in the usual controlled way that defined Omar's estate, but in a heavier, more uneasy sense. Conversations were shorter. Movements were more cautious. Even the staff seemed to carry a tension they couldn't quite explain. Grace noticed it the moment she returned the next morning. She kept her head down as always, her routine unchanged on the surface. But inside, something had shifted. The humiliation from the previous day lingered, not just in her memory, but in the way people looked at her now. Not openly hostile, but watchful, measured, as if she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Ethan hadn't said much either. That morning, before she left, he had simply asked one question. "Are you still going back there?" Grace had paused at the door. "Yes," she said gently. "Why?" She didn't answer right away, because the truth wasn't simple. "I need to," she finally replied. Ethan nodded, but his eyes told her he didn't fully understand. And maybe he wasn't supposed to. Back at the estate, Grace avoided the main wing for as long as she could. She focused on the outer corridors, the guest rooms, the areas where her presence would go unnoticed. But avoidance didn't last. It never did. Grace. She stopped. The voice came from behind her. Soft. Uncertain. But unmistakable. Walter. She turned slowly. He stood at the end of the hallway, leaning slightly on his cane. His expression wasn't confused this time. It was searching. "You didn't come yesterday," he said. Grace hesitated. "I was asked to leave early," she replied carefully. Walter frowned. "Why?" Grace glanced briefly down the hallway. "I don't think that matters." Walter's grip on the cane tightened. "It matters to me." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Grace stepped closer, lowering her voice. "There was a misunderstanding," she said. "It's been handled." Walter studied her face. Not the words, the truth behind them. "They think you took something," he said quietly. Grace didn't react, because denying it again wouldn't change anything. "I didn't," she said simply. Walter nodded. "I know. That was it. No doubt. No hesitation. Just trust." Grace felt something shift inside her, but she kept her expression steady. "You should get some rest," she said gently. "You've been walking more than usual." Walter didn't move. "They don't listen," he said. "Not really." Grace met his gaze. "Sometimes people don't know how to," she replied. Walter let out a slow breath. "Stay a moment," he said. Grace hesitated, then nodded. They walked together, slowly, toward the small sitting area near the window. Walter lowered himself into the chair with care, and Grace remained standing nearby. "I spoke to my lawyer this morning," he said suddenly. Grace blinked. "That's good," she replied, unsure where he was going. Walter looked out the window. "I asked him about control," he continued, "about who decides what happens to me." Grace's chest tightened slightly. "That sounds important," she said. Walter nodded. "They think I don't understand things anymore," he added. "But I understand enough." There was no anger in his voice. Just quiet clarity. Grace didn't interrupt. "I may forget names," Walter said, "or dates, but I don't forget how people treat me." The words settled between them, heavy, honest. Grace shifted slightly, unsure how to respond. "You don't have to fix everything," she said softly. Walter looked at her. "I know," he replied, "but I can still choose." Grace nodded. "And that matters." A silence followed. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt steady. For the first time in days, Walter's breathing was even, his posture relaxed, and for a brief moment, everything felt balanced again. Across the estate, a quiet alert blinked on a secured monitor. "Unscheduled interaction detected. Secondary hallway." Omar al-Haytham sat in front of the screen, his gaze fixed. He had already reviewed the footage from the previous day multiple times. The search, the accusations, the way the boy had looked at his mother, and now, this, Walter speaking calmly, clearly, with intention. Because of her, Omar leaned forward slightly, his expression tightening. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't luck. It was influence. But not the kind he understood. Back in the hallway, Grace stood to leave. "I should get back to work," she said. Walter nodded. But before she turned, he spoke again. "You don't take money when it feels wrong, do you?" Grace paused. "No," she said. Walter watched her carefully. "I asked someone to help you," he said. "With your son." Grace's expression shifted just slightly. "You shouldn't have done that," she replied. "He needs it," Walter said. So do a lot of people, Grace answered gently. That doesn't mean I take what isn't mine. Walter held her gaze, then nodded. Good, he said. Grace gave a small, respectful smile, then turned and walked away. Walter remained where he was, watching the empty hallway long after she disappeared. Because what he saw in her wasn't just kindness. It was something rarer, something most people in that house had forgotten how to recognize. And somewhere, behind a screen filled with silent images, Omar Al-Haytham made a decision. He reached for his phone, booked a flight, canceled a meeting, and stood up, because watching was no longer enough. If he wanted to understand what was happening in his own home, he would have to see it for himself, in person. And no one in that house was prepared for what would happen next. No one saw him arrive. That was the point. Omar Al-Haytham stepped out of the black car just before dusk, the fading light casting long shadows across the estate. The gates had opened without a sound, the security team already aware of his return, but under strict instruction to say nothing. He didn't want an announcement. He didn't want preparation. He wanted the truth. Unfiltered. Unmanaged. As he walked through the front entrance, everything looked the same. Perfect. Silent. Controlled. But now, he knew better. He moved through the hallway without a word, his footsteps measured, his expression unreadable. Staff members who caught a glimpse of him froze, unsure whether to greet him or pretend they hadn't seen anything at all. No one spoke. No one warned anyone. And within minutes, Omar reached the secondary wing, the same corridor he had watched countless times through a screen. Except now he wasn't watching. He was there. At the far end of the hallway, a dim light spilled from the open door of Walter's room. Voices. Soft. Calm. Omar slowed, then stopped just outside the doorway. Inside, the scene unfolded quietly. Walter sat near the window, his posture relaxed, his face peaceful. And beside him, Grace. She wasn't doing anything extraordinary. No dramatic gestures, no calculated movements. She was simply there, listening. You remember that story? Walter asked, his voice steady. Grace smiled faintly. The one about the train you took when you were younger? Walter nodded. They said it would only take a few hours, he murmured. But it felt like crossing a lifetime. Grace didn't interrupt, didn't correct. She just listened. And Walter kept talking. For the first time in days, he sounded like himself. Omar's jaw tightened, because what he was seeing didn't make sense. Not in his world, not in his system. This woman, this cleaner, was doing what trained professionals, paid specialists, and carefully designed routines had failed to do. And she wasn't even trying. That was what unsettled him the most. He stepped forward. The floor creaked softly beneath his weight. Both of them turned. Grace froze. Walter blinked. And for a moment, no one spoke. Omar? Walter said slowly, his voice uncertain. Grace stood up immediately, instinctively stepping back. I didn't know you were back, she said quietly. Omar didn't respond right away. His eyes moved between them, taking in every detail, every expression, every unspoken connection. I wasn't supposed to be, he said finally. His tone was calm. Too calm. Walter frowned slightly. You said you were in Chicago. Omar's gaze didn't shift. I say a lot of things, he replied. The room felt colder. He took another step inside. Closer now. Too close. How long has this been going on? He asked. Grace stiffened. I'm sorry? This, Omar said, gesturing between her and his father. Whatever this is. Walter's expression darkened. She's been helping me, he said. Omar didn't look at him. He was still watching Grace. You're not part of his care team, he said. You're not trained. You're not authorized to be here. Grace swallowed, but her voice remained steady. I never claimed to be. Then what exactly are you doing? Omar asked. The question wasn't loud, but it cut deeper than anything else. Grace hesitated. I talked to him, she said. Omar let out a short, humorless breath. That's your answer? It's the truth. Walter shifted in his seat. She listens, he said firmly. That's more than most people in this house. Omar's eyes flicked toward him. Dad, you don't understand. No, Walter interrupted, his voice sharper now. You don't understand. The words hung in the air, heavy, uncomfortable. Omar's expression hardened. I understand enough to know when someone is crossing boundaries, he said. And this, he gestured again toward Grace, is far beyond acceptable. Grace took a small step back. I never meant to cause any problems, she said. But you did, Omar replied immediately. Silence. Then, I didn't take anything, Grace added, her voice quieter now. Omar's eyes narrowed slightly. I'm aware of the accusation, he said. And I'm also aware that nothing was found. Grace didn't respond, because that didn't change how it felt. That's not the issue, Omar continued. The issue is access, influence, proximity. Walter leaned forward slightly. She's not influencing me, he said. She's treating me like a person. Omar finally turned to face him fully. You're not in a position to make that distinction right now. The words landed hard. Walter's grip tightened on the armrest. Say that again, he said quietly. Omar didn't hesitate. You're not thinking clearly, he repeated. The room fell silent. Grace felt it. The shift. The line that had just been crossed. Walter's expression changed. Not confusion, not weakness, but something else entirely, something firm, something undeniable. I know exactly what I'm saying, he replied, and I know exactly who she is. Omar shook his head slightly. You don't, he said. You see what you want to see. And you see nothing at all, Walter shot back. The tension snapped. For a moment it felt like the entire house had stopped breathing. Grace stepped forward, her voice calm but urgent. Please, she said, this isn't helping. Omar didn't look at her. This doesn't involve you anymore, he said. It never involved me to begin with, she replied. That caught his attention. He turned, really looked at her this time, not as staff, not as background, but as someone standing in front of him. I'm here because he asked me to be, she said. That's all. Omar held her gaze, longer than expected. Then, slowly, he spoke. You're done here. The words were final, cold, absolute. Grace didn't argue, didn't plead. She simply nodded. All right, she said. Walter's head snapped toward her. No, he said, you're not leaving. Grace looked at him gently. It's okay, she said. It's not, Walter replied, his voice rising. You don't get to decide that. Omar stepped forward again. I do, he said. Walter stared at him. For a long moment, then, quietly, he spoke. She did what my own son never had time to do. The words hit harder than anything else in the room. Omar froze, just for a second, but it was enough, because in that moment, something shifted. Not in the house, not in the situation, but in him. And he didn't even realize it yet. So the question remained. Had he just protected his father? Or pushed away the only person who truly understood him? The door closed behind Grace with a soft, final click. For a moment, no one moved. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, pressing, unforgiving. Walter remained seated, his eyes fixed on the empty doorway, as if he expected her to return at any second. "She's not coming back, is she?" he asked quietly. Omar didn't answer. He stood near the center of the room, his posture rigid, his expression carefully controlled. But inside, something had begun to shift. Not enough to show, but enough to feel. "You shouldn't have done that," Walter continued, his voice lower now, but steady. "You don't understand what you just took away." Omar finally spoke. "I understand more than you think," he said. Walter turned his head slowly. "No," he replied. "You understand systems, you understand control, but you don't understand people." The words struck deeper than Omar expected, but he didn't react. He couldn't. Because reacting meant acknowledging, and acknowledging meant accepting that something, someone, outside of his control had mattered. "I'm trying to protect you," Omar said instead. Walter let out a soft, tired breath. "From what?" he asked. Omar hesitated. From manipulation. From risk. From losing what little stability remained. But none of those answers felt complete, because the truth was, he didn't fully know anymore. Before he could respond, the door opened again. Mrs. Dalton stepped inside, her posture straight, her expression composed, but her eyes flickered briefly with something closer to satisfaction than concern. "Sir," she said to Omar, "I trust the situation has been handled." Omar didn't look at her. "Is there anything else?" he asked. Mrs. Dalton hesitated, then continued. "There are a few matters you should be aware of," she said, "regarding staff conduct and certain irregularities over the past few days." Omar's gaze shifted slightly. "Go on." Mrs. Dalton glanced briefly at Walter, then back at Omar. "I believe Miss Miller has been exceeding her role for some time now," she said. "Entering restricted areas, engaging in unauthorized interactions, and, potentially, attempting to gain influence." Walter's hand tightened on the armrest. "That's not true," he said. Mrs. Dalton didn't acknowledge him. "I've documented several instances," she continued, "including prolonged visits in your father's room after hours." Omar remained silent, listening, calculating. "Additionally," Mrs. Dalton added, "there was the matter of the missing watch this morning." Omar's eyes narrowed slightly. "It was found," he said. "Yes," Mrs. Dalton replied, "but not before considerable concern was raised. Given the circumstances, it would not be unreasonable to question." "That's enough," Omar interrupted. The room went still. Mrs. Dalton blinked, surprised. Omar turned to face her fully. "Are you suggesting she took it?" he asked. Mrs. Dalton paused. "I'm suggesting that her presence has created instability," she said carefully. Omar studied her. For the first time, not as a subordinate, but as a variable. "Leave us," he said. Mrs. Dalton hesitated. "Sir, now." The word was quiet, but absolute. She nodded quickly. "Of course." And with that, she left. The door closed again. Silence returned. But it felt different this time. Sharper. More focused. Walter watched Omar closely. "You're starting to see it, aren't you?" he said. Omar didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned and walked toward the small desk near the window. A tablet rested there, linked to the estate's internal systems. Without a word, he picked it up. Accessed the footage. Scrolled. Hours of recordings. Days of interactions. All reduced to data. Patterns. Evidence. At first, everything looked the same. Routine. Predictable. Controlled. Then, he found it. The night. Grace, sitting beside Walter. Not doing anything extraordinary, just listening. Another clip. The nurse attempting to force medication, Walter resisting. Then Grace entering, speaking, calming him. Another. The garden. Ethan sitting beside Walter, talking about maps. Walter smiling. Omar's grip tightened slightly. He kept watching. The search. Grace standing still as her belongings were examined. The boy watching from the doorway. Silent. Helpless. Omar paused the footage. Zoomed in. On Ethan's face. The confusion. The fear. The quiet understanding that something wasn't fair. But there was nothing he could do about it. Omar leaned back slowly. His mind moving faster now. Connecting. Re-evaluating. Reconstructing. Everything he thought he knew. Everything he believed he controlled. Walter's voice broke the silence. She didn't ask for anything, he said. Not money. Not attention. Nothing. Omar didn't look up. She refused help, Walter continued, even when she needed it. That made Omar pause. He glanced at another report, a note. Financial assistance declined. He hadn't paid attention to it before. Now, it mattered. She's not like the others, Walter said. Omar closed the tablet, set it down, and for the first time since returning, he felt something unfamiliar. Doubt. Not in his system, not in his decisions, but in himself. Because if Grace hadn't been manipulating anything, if she hadn't been trying to gain access, if everything she had done was exactly what it appeared to be, then the problem wasn't her. It was how he had seen her. Omar stood still for a long moment, then turned toward the door. Where are you going? Walter asked. Omar didn't answer right away. He reached for his jacket, adjusted it slightly, then finally said, I need to fix something. Walter watched him, carefully, because he had seen that look before. Not often, but enough to recognize it. It wasn't control. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper, something harder to admit. Regret. And as Omar stepped out into the hallway, his mind was already made up, because watching had shown him the truth. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. If he wanted to understand what had really happened, he would have to face it directly, face her, and for the first time in a very long time. Omar al-Haytham wasn't walking toward a negotiation, or a deal, or a problem he could solve with power. He was walking toward something far more uncertain. A conversation. And the question was, would she even be willing to listen? By the time Omar reached the city, night had already settled in. The streets were alive in a way his estate never was. Cars passing in uneven rhythm, distant voices overlapping. Lights flickering from apartment windows stacked one above another. It was chaotic, uncontrolled, real. Omar stepped out of the car and paused for a moment, looking up at the building in front of him. It was older, worn, nothing like the places he was used to entering. For the first time in years, He didn't feel like he belonged somewhere. He walked inside anyway. The hallway smelled faintly of detergent and old paint. A flickering light buzzed overhead as he made his way toward the apartment number he had been given. 3B. He stopped in front of the door, then knocked. There was a brief pause. Footsteps. And then the door opened. Grace stood there, her expression shifting the moment she saw him. Not surprise, not fear, just understanding. "I figured you'd come," she said quietly. Omar didn't respond immediately. He wasn't used to being expected. "Can I come in?" he asked. Grace hesitated for only a second, then stepped aside. The apartment was small, simple, clean in a way that spoke more of effort than luxury. A single couch, a narrow table, a few scattered drawings on the wall, most of them clearly done by a child. Ethan sat at the table, looking up the moment Omar entered. His posture stiffened. Grace noticed. "It's okay," she said gently. "Go to your room for a bit." Ethan didn't argue, but as he passed Omar, he glanced up. Just for a second. There was no anger in his eyes, just something quieter, something harder to face. Omar watched him disappear down the hallway, then turned back to Grace. "You didn't tell him to stay," he said. Grace crossed her arms lightly. "He's already seen enough," she replied. Omar nodded. "Fair." A silence settled between them, different from the silence in his house. This one wasn't controlled. It was honest. "I came to talk," he said. Grace gave a small, almost tired smile. "I assumed that." Omar took a step forward. "I reviewed everything," he continued. "The footage, the reports, the interactions." Grace didn't react, because she already knew what he would find. "I made a mistake," Omar said. The words felt unfamiliar, heavy, but he didn't take them back. Grace studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "Okay," she said. That was it. No accusation, no demand, just acknowledgement. Omar frowned slightly. "You don't seem surprised." "I'm not," she replied. "Why?" Grace exhaled slowly. "Because people like you don't act without checking first," she said. "You just act too quickly sometimes." The honesty in her voice wasn't disrespectful. It was precise. Omar absorbed it without interruption. "I shouldn't have dismissed you like that," he said. "No," Grace agreed. "You shouldn't have." Another silence. Then, "I need you to come back," Omar said. Grace shook her head immediately. "No." The response came faster than he expected. "I'll compensate you," he added. "More than—" "That's not the issue," she cut in. Omar paused. "Then what is?" Grace met his gaze directly. "You didn't just send me away," she said. "You made a decision about who I am. In front of everyone. In front of my son." The words landed, harder than anything else she could have said. Omar didn't interrupt. "You don't get to fix that with money," she continued. "I'm not trying to fix it with money," he replied. Grace raised an eyebrow slightly. "Then what are you trying to do?" Omar hesitated, because for once, he didn't have a clear answer. "I need you there," he said finally. Grace's expression softened slightly, but not in the way he expected. "For him," she said. Omar nodded. "Yes." Grace looked away for a moment, thinking, then back at him. "If I come back," she said, "it's not for you." "I understand. And it's not because you asked." "I know." It's because he needs someone to listen, she finished. Omar didn't argue, because that part was true. A small sound came from the hallway. Ethan. He stood there quietly, watching. Grace turned slightly. "It's okay," she said. Ethan stepped forward slowly. "Is he okay?" he asked, looking at Omar. The question wasn't about him. Omar understood that. "He's better when someone's with him," Omar said. Ethan nodded, then looked at his mother. "You should go," he said. Grace blinked. "What?" "You help him," Ethan added. "And he helps you too." Grace didn't respond right away, because sometimes children saw things more clearly than adults. Omar watched the exchange. Something in his expression shifted again. Not control, not calculation. Something quieter. "Just for a few days," he said, "until things stabilize." Grace hesitated, then nodded once. "All right." Relief flickered across Omar's face, but only for a moment. "Thank you," he said. Grace didn't smile. "This isn't a favor," she replied. "It's temporary." "I understand." Another pause. Then Omar reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. "There's something else," he said. "An opportunity. For you." Grace didn't take it. "What kind of opportunity?" "Training," Omar said. "Medical support, education. You mentioned you used to study—" "I didn't mention that," Grace interrupted. Omar paused, then realized. Walter. "He did," Omar admitted. Grace looked at the card again, but still didn't reach for it. "I don't need charity," she said. "It's not charity," Omar replied. "It's a door." Grace held his gaze. Then finally, she took the card. Not as acceptance, but not as rejection either. And in that small moment, something shifted. Not just between them, but within Omar himself. Because for the first time, he wasn't offering something to control the outcome. He was offering something he couldn't control at all. And that made it real. Back at the estate, Walter sat by the window once again, waiting, hoping. And when the door finally opened, he didn't look surprised. He just smiled, because some things he had already known would come back. But what he was about to reveal next would change everything. The library had always been Walter Hayes's favorite room, not because of the books, not because of the quiet, but because it was the only place in the house that still felt like his. That morning, the curtains were drawn open, letting in a soft stream of sunlight that cut across the polished floor and climbed slowly up the walls lined with history. Grace stood near the doorway, unsure whether to step in. Walter sat at the center table, dressed more neatly than usual, his posture upright, his expression unusually clear. Omar stood across from him. So did Mrs. Dalton. And beside her, a man in a tailored suit, Walter's lawyer. "This won't take long," Walter said calmly, his voice steady in a way no one had heard in weeks. Grace stepped inside quietly. "You asked for me," she said. Walter nodded. "I did." Omar glanced at her briefly. Their eyes met for a moment, then shifted away. The tension in the room was immediate, unavoidable. Walter rested both hands on the table, his fingers interlocked as if grounding himself. "I don't always remember things," he began. "Not the way I used to." Mrs. Dalton remained silent. Omar said nothing. "But there are moments," Walter continued, "when everything becomes very clear." He turned slightly toward Grace. And when that happens, I know exactly who I'm looking at." Grace didn't speak. She simply listened. Because something about his tone felt different. "Years ago," Walter said slowly, "before any of this, before the house, the staff, the systems," he paused, as if searching. Then found it. "I was in a hospital," he said, "sitting beside my wife while she was dying." The room went still. Omar's expression tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "She was in pain," Walter continued, "and I didn't know how to help her. I didn't know how to help myself." His voice didn't break, but something in it shifted. "I remember a nurse," he said, "not because of her name. I don't remember that." He looked at Grace again, but because of how she spoke, how she stayed, how she treated my wife like she was still someone. Grace's breath caught slightly, unnoticeable to most, but not to Walter. "She didn't rush," he said. "Didn't act like it was just another shift. She listened, even when there was nothing left to fix." The lawyer glanced up briefly, then back down at his notes. Walter leaned back slightly. "And outside that room, there was a little girl," he added. Grace's eyes widened just slightly. "She used to sit in the hallway," Walter said. "Drawing, quiet, always watching." A long pause. "She gave her food to another patient once," he continued. "Didn't think anyone saw her." Grace didn't move. Didn't speak because now she remembered. Not clearly, but enough. "That girl," Walter said softly, "was you." The words settled into the room like a slow wave. Mrs. Dalton frowned. Omar blinked. Grace stood completely still. "I didn't recognize you at first," Walter admitted. "Not with everything, fading in and out." He tapped lightly against his temple, but something felt familiar. He gestured gently toward her. "The way you speak," he said. "The way you stay. The way you don't treat people like they're broken." Grace's throat tightened, because it wasn't just a memory. It was something she had forgotten she had been. Walter turned toward Omar. "You think I trust her by accident?" he asked. Omar didn't respond. "You think this is confusion?" Walter continued. "That I've somehow lost the ability to tell who's real?" Omar's jaw tightened. "I never said that," he replied. "You didn't have to," Walter said quietly. A silence followed. But it didn't last. Because Walter wasn't finished. He reached toward the lawyer, who immediately handed him a document. Walter placed it on the table. "This," he said, "is a directive." Omar's eyes moved to the paper. "What kind of directive?" "One that restores my right to choose who is allowed to be part of my care," Walter replied. "Regardless of what anyone else thinks." Mrs. Dalton stepped forward. "Sir, with all due respect, this could be influenced." Walter raised his hand, and she stopped. "I may forget things," he said, "but I do not forget how someone makes me feel." He looked directly at her. "And I do not forget how someone treats me when they think I won't notice." Mrs. Dalton said nothing, because for the first time, she understood. Walter turned back to Omar. "And there's something else," he said. Omar met his gaze, steady, waiting. Walter's expression shifted again. Not softer, not weaker, but sharper, clearer than it had been in a long time. "You weren't in Chicago," he said. The words landed without warning. Omar didn't react. Not outwardly, but inside, everything paused. Walter leaned forward slightly. "I knew," he continued. "From the beginning, Grace's eyes moved between them. Mrs. Dalton stiffened. "You watched everything," Walter said. "Through your screens, your reports, your systems." Omar's silence confirmed it. Walter nodded slowly. "I let you," he added. Now Omar's expression changed, just slightly. "Why?" he asked. Walter didn't answer immediately. He let the question settle. Then, "So you could see what I see," he said. The room felt smaller, tighter, more real. "You think you're protecting me," Walter continued, "but all you've been doing is keeping yourself distant." Omar didn't speak, because for the first time, he didn't have a defense. "I wanted you to witness it," Walter said. "Not hear about it, not analyze it, but see it." He gestured toward Grace. "See what kindness looks like when it isn't controlled," he said. A long silence followed. Then Walter leaned back, exhausted, but certain. "I'm done being managed," he said quietly. "And I'm done watching you push away the only people who actually care." The words settled, final, unavoidable, and for the first time since stepping into that room, Omar didn't look like the man in control. He looked like a son, standing in front of a truth he could no longer ignore. So the question wasn't whether things would change. They already had. The real question was, what would he do now that he finally understood? The silence that followed Walter's words didn't break. It settled. Heavy. Unavoidable. Omar stood there, unmoving, as if the ground beneath him had shifted in a way he couldn't immediately understand. For years, he had believed that awareness came from observation, from data, from patterns. But now, standing in that room, looking at his father, at Grace, at the quiet truth laid bare in front of him, he realized something he had never allowed himself to consider. He had been watching everything, and still, seeing nothing. Walter leaned back in his chair, his energy clearly fading after the effort of speaking so clearly for so long. But his eyes remained steady, certain. Grace didn't speak. She didn't need to. Because this moment wasn't hers to control. It was his. Omar exhaled slowly. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the library, the door closed behind him, leaving the weight of everything unsaid hanging in the air. The changes began quietly, not with announcements, not with speeches, but with decisions. The next morning, Mrs. Dalton was called into Omar's office. She entered with her usual composure, though something in her posture suggested she already sensed what was coming. "You wanted to see me, sir?" she asked. Omar stood by the window, his back turned. "Yes." A pause. Then he turned. "I've reviewed everything," he said. Mrs. Dalton nodded slightly. "I assumed you would." Omar stepped closer. "Your reports were thorough," he continued. "Your documentation precise." There was no warmth in his voice, no approval either, just clarity. Mrs. Dalton held his gaze. "I've always acted in the best interest of this household," she said. "I'm sure you believe that," Omar replied. The words weren't harsh, but they carried weight. Mrs. Dalton's expression tightened. "If there's something specific you'd like to address—" "There is," Omar interrupted. Another pause. Then, "You're dismissed." The words landed without hesitation, without negotiation. Mrs. Dalton blinked. "I'm sorry." "You've been with this house for years," Omar said, "and I respect that. But respect doesn't excuse behavior that undermines trust." Mrs. Dalton straightened. I enforced the rules you put in place. No, Omar said calmly. You enforced your interpretation of them. The distinction was clear. Final. Mrs. Dalton's composure cracked for the first time. She crossed boundaries, she said. I acted accordingly. Omar shook his head slightly. You assumed intent, he replied, without evidence, and you acted on it in a way that humiliated someone who did nothing wrong. Silence. Then, I won't argue with you, Mrs. Dalton said stiffly. I don't expect you to, Omar replied. Another pause. Then she nodded once. Very well. And just like that. She turned and left. No protest, no apology. Just the quiet end of something that had once seemed permanent. Upstairs, the atmosphere began to shift. New staff were brought in. Not more, but different. People trained not just in procedure, but in presence, in patience. Walter noticed immediately. They don't rush anymore, he said one afternoon as he sat by the window. Grace smiled faintly. That's a good thing. Walter nodded. They listen more, he added. Grace glanced at him. Maybe they're learning. Walter studied her for a moment, then smiled. Maybe they are. Omar stood in the doorway, watching. He didn't interrupt, didn't step in. He simply observed. But this time, it wasn't through a screen. It wasn't filtered. It wasn't controlled. It was real, and for the first time, he allowed himself to stay in that moment, without trying to change it, without trying to direct it. Grace noticed him. Of course she did. But she didn't react. She simply continued talking to Walter, her tone steady, her presence unchanged. That, more than anything else, stayed with Omar, because she wasn't performing, she wasn't adjusting. She was simply being who she was, and that was something he had never understood before. Later that evening, Omar found Grace in the hallway. She was finishing her shift, her cart already half-packed. Can we talk? He asked. Grace paused, then nodded. They stepped into a quieter part of the corridor. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Omar did something unexpected. He lowered his gaze. Just slightly. I owe you an apology, he said. Grace didn't respond immediately. I judged you, he continued, without understanding who you were, or what you were doing. Still, she said nothing. I was wrong, he added. The words felt different this time. Not rehearsed, not calculated, just honest. Grace looked at him. Really looked. And for the first time, she didn't see a billionaire or an employer. She saw someone trying. I accept that, she said quietly. Omar nodded. Relief flickered across his expression. But it didn't last long, because he knew acceptance wasn't the same as trust. I also wanted to say, he continued, thank you. Grace blinked slightly. For what? For staying, Omar said, when you didn't have to. A pause. Then, he needed someone, she replied. Omar nodded. I know. Another silence. Then Grace shifted slightly. I should get back, she said. Omar didn't stop her, but just before she turned, he spoke again. There's something else, he said. Grace paused. Omar hesitated. Then, I'd like to help you continue your education, he said, not as a favor, not as an obligation, as an opportunity. Grace didn't answer right away, because this time, it felt different. Not like an offer meant to fix something, but something else. Something uncertain. Something real. I'll think about it, she said. Omar nodded. That's all I ask. She turned, walked away, and Omar remained where he was, watching. Not as someone in control, but as someone learning. Because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to change everything. He was trying to understand it. And that was where everything truly began. Upstairs, Walter sat quietly, a book resting in his hands. But he wasn't reading. He was listening to the faint sound of voices in the hallway, to the subtle shift in the house, to the quiet rebuilding of something that had been missing for far too long. And for the first time in years, he felt at peace. But the question remained, could this fragile change truly last? Or was it only the beginning of something deeper? Change didn't arrive all at once. It settled slowly, like light through a window that had been closed for too long. At first, it was in the smallest things, the way the staff spoke to Walter, the way they paused before interrupting him, the way they waited instead of rushing. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. And different was enough. Grace noticed it immediately. Not because anyone told her, but because the house felt less rigid, less like a place where everything was controlled, and more like a place where people were beginning to exist again. Walter sat by the window one afternoon, watching the garden as he often did. But instead of silence, there was conversation. "Do you remember this one?" Grace asked, holding up a book. Walter leaned forward slightly. "The train story," he said. Grace smiled. "You're getting better." Walter shook his head. "No," he replied. "I'm just not as alone." The words lingered. Grace didn't respond. She didn't need to, because she understood. Across the room, Omar stood quietly. He had become a familiar presence now. Not distant, not imposing, but there. Sometimes he joined them, sometimes he didn't, but he always stayed close enough to listen, and more importantly, to learn. That afternoon, he stepped forward. "There's something I'd like to discuss," he said. Grace looked up. Walter glanced between them, then leaned back slightly. "I'll give you space," he said, already sensing what was coming. Grace hesitated, but followed Omar out into the hallway. The door closed softly behind them. They stood facing each other in the quiet corridor. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Omar did. "I meant what I said before," he began. "About your education." Grace crossed her arms lightly. Not defensive, but cautious. "I know," she said. "I've looked into programs," Omar continued. "Flexible schedules, clinical training, financial support." Grace listened, but her expression didn't change. "You don't need to do that," she said. "I'm not doing it because I need to," Omar replied. "I'm doing it because you should have had the chance already." The words landed differently this time, not as pressure, not as control, but as recognition. Grace looked away for a moment, thinking. "You don't know what that would mean for me," she said quietly. "I don't," Omar admitted, "but I'd like to understand." Grace exhaled slowly. "It's not just school," she said. "It's time, money, responsibility. My son." "I've considered that," Omar replied. "There are programs with flexible hours, and I can arrange support, childcare, transportation, without interfering in your decisions." Grace raised an eyebrow slightly. "Without interfering?" Omar nodded. "I won't make choices for you," he said. "Only make them possible." That was the difference, and Grace felt it. Because for the first time, he wasn't offering a solution. He was offering space. I don't want to owe you anything, she said. You won't, Omar replied. Grace held his gaze, then asked the question that mattered most. Why are you doing this? Omar paused, not because he didn't have an answer, but because the truth wasn't something he had ever said out loud before. Because I spent a long time believing that control was the same as care, he said. And I was wrong. Grace didn't interrupt. I thought providing everything meant I was doing enough, he continued, but I never actually asked what people needed. He met her eyes. You didn't need money, he said. You needed respect. The honesty in his voice was quiet, but undeniable. Grace felt something shift again. Not completely, but enough. I'll think about it, she said. Omar nodded. That's all I ask. Days passed, then weeks. And slowly, things began to take shape. Grace started attending evening classes. At first, just a few hours a week. Then more. Ethan adjusted too. He spent afternoons at a small program arranged nearby. Nothing extravagant, nothing overwhelming, just a place where he could learn, play, and be around other children. He didn't complain. He didn't resist. Because he understood something his age shouldn't have required him to understand. This mattered. Back at the estate, Walter noticed every change. You're tired, he said one evening as Grace sat down across from him. A little, she admitted. But you're still here. Grace smiled faintly. I said I would be. Walter nodded. And I believe you. That was the difference now. Belief, trust, things that couldn't be scheduled, couldn't be managed. Omar stood by the doorway again, watching, but no longer from a distance. He stepped inside. Dinner's ready, he said. Walter looked at him, then at Grace. Will you join us? He asked her. Grace hesitated, for just a second, then nodded. Yes. It was a small moment, simple, quiet, but it meant more than anything that had happened before, because for the first time, they weren't separated by roles or expectations or assumptions. They were just people, sitting at the same table, sharing the same space. And somewhere in that moment, Walter smiled. Not because everything was perfect, but because something real had finally taken root. Later that night, as the house settled into silence, Walter sat by the window once more. But this time, he wasn't waiting. He wasn't searching. He wasn't lost. He simply watched the lights in the distance, his mind clear in a way it hadn't been in years. Behind him, the door opened quietly. Omar stepped in. Couldn't sleep? Walter asked. Omar shook his head. No. A pause, then, You did good, Walter said. Omar looked at him. For once, he added with a faint smile. Omar let out a small breath. Not by myself, he said. Walter nodded. That's the point. Silence settled again. But it wasn't heavy. It was complete. And as Omar stood there, looking at his father, not as someone to manage, but as someone to understand, he realized something he had never allowed himself to see before. Some things couldn't be built, or controlled, or bought. They had to be earned. And for the first time in his life, he was finally ready to do that. But even as everything seemed to fall into place, one question remained. Would this new beginning truly last, or would the past find a way to return? Time didn't fix everything, but it gave space for things to grow. Weeks turned into months, and the estate that once felt like a place built on silence and control began to change in ways that couldn't be measured by systems or schedules. It felt lived in. Walter noticed it first. Not because he was looking for change, but because he could feel it. The tension that had once lingered in every hallway had softened. The staff moved differently now, not out of fear, but with awareness. Conversations happened where silence used to dominate. And for the first time in a long time, Walter didn't feel like a responsibility being managed. He felt like a person again. One afternoon, he sat in the library, a book open in his hands. But instead of drifting in and out of thought, he was focused, his eyes steady, his mind present. Across from him, Grace flipped through her notes. Medical terminology, patient care protocols, things that once felt distant, now within reach. "You're getting faster," Walter said, watching her. Grace smiled faintly. "I have to," she replied. "There's a lot to catch up on." Walter nodded. "You'll catch up," he said. "You always do." Grace glanced up. "You sound very sure." "I am," Walter replied simply. There was no doubt in his voice, because he had seen something in her long before anyone else had. And now, so had Omar. He stood quietly near the doorway, observing the scene. Not as an outsider, but as someone finally present. "Ready?" he asked. Grace closed her notebook. "Yeah." Walter looked between them. "Where are you two going?" he asked. Grace hesitated, then smiled slightly. "She has a practical evaluation today," Omar said. Walter's eyes lit up faintly. "Ah," he said, "a real test." Grace stood. "Just a small one," she replied. Walter shook his head. "No test is small," he said. "It just depends on what you're proving." Grace absorbed that, then nodded. "I'll be back later," she said. Walter smiled. "I know you will." Outside, the air was crisp, clear. Grace walked beside Omar toward the car, her steps steady, but her mind focused. "You don't have to drive me," she said. "I know," Omar replied. "I want to." Grace didn't argue. Because at some point, things had stopped being about obligation and started becoming something else, something quieter, something real. As they drove through the city, the silence between them wasn't awkward, it was comfortable. "You're nervous," Omar said after a moment. Grace let out a small breath. "A little?" "That's normal." "I haven't done this in years," she admitted. "Sometimes I feel like I'm starting over." Omar glanced at her briefly. "Or maybe you're picking up where you left off." Grace considered that, then nodded slightly. "Maybe." They pulled up in front of the training center. Grace paused before opening the door. "Thank you," she said. Omar nodded. "Go do what you're good at." Grace stepped out, and for a moment, Omar watched her walk inside, not as someone he had helped, but as someone who had changed him. Back at the estate, Ethan sat at the dining table, working on a school project. Walter sat nearby, occasionally glancing over. "You're using the wrong scale," Walter said. Ethan frowned. "I am?" Walter nodded. "If you want it to make sense, you have to keep everything consistent." Ethan adjusted the ruler. "Like this?" Walter smiled. "Exactly." Ethan grinned slightly. "You're good at this." Walter leaned back. "I used to teach," he said. Ethan nodded. "I know." A pause. Then, "Do you like it here?" Ethan asked. Walter looked around. At the room. At the light coming through the windows. At the quiet that no longer felt empty. "Yes," he said. "I do." Ethan smiled. "Me too." That evening, they gathered again in the library, not because it was scheduled, not because it was required, but because it had become habit. Walter sat in his chair, Ethan on the floor with his drawings, Grace beside the table, reviewing her notes, and Omar, standing for a moment before finally taking a seat. With them. Not apart, not above, just there. Walter closed his book, then looked at each of them in turn. "There's something I've been thinking about," he said. They all looked up. "This house," he continued, "it used to feel full." He paused. "But not alive." Grace listened. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Omar remained still. "It had everything," Walter said, "except the one thing that mattered." "And what's that?" Ethan asked. Walter smiled faintly. "People who stay," he said. The words lingered. Soft, but powerful. Grace glanced at Omar. He didn't look away, because he understood now. Not just the words, but the meaning behind them. The cost of absence, the value of presence, the difference between providing and being there. Walter leaned back, satisfied. Because this time, he didn't feel like he had to explain anything. They already knew. Weeks later, the announcement came. Not grand, not public, but meaningful. Omar established a program, quietly funded through one of his foundations, to support low-income workers pursuing careers in caregiving and healthcare. No press release. No spotlight. Just opportunity. Grace wasn't named. She didn't need to be. Because what mattered was the impact and the lesson behind it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the estate, the four of them sat together once more. Walter read aloud. Ethan listened. Grace followed along. And Omar simply stayed, not as a billionaire, not as a man in control, but as a son, a learner, a human being. And in that moment, everything felt complete, not perfect, but real. Because in the end, it wasn't wealth that changed everything. It wasn't power, or status, or control. It was something much simpler, something quieter, something most people overlook. Kindness, and the willingness to see someone for who they truly are. Not where they come from, not what they wear, but what they carry inside. Because the truth is, the people we often ignore may be the very ones who change our lives forever. So before you judge someone by their appearance, take a moment, look closer. You might just discover something you never expected. And if this story meant something to you, don't forget to share where you're watching from and what time it is there. And subscribe for more stories that remind us what truly matters.